Thank you very much for inviting me to the conference. It's been a wonderful discussion so far, and I hope to add to the discussion of public spaces in two primary ways, I think both pretty minor but hopefully constructive. The first way is to be a little bit more explicit about the conception of democracy that we've talked about, and I think people have very different conceptions of democracy in their minds when they think about public spaces, and I think being clear on what you mean by democracy is important to be clear about what you mean by a public space and the contributions of public space to democracy. So the first conceptual task that I'll take on is saying a few words about what my operating conception of democracy is and what the contribution of public spaces are to democracy on that conception. And then, so that's a kind of quite general task, and then I'll move down to a very specific level by describing a particular category of public spaces that may have escaped your attention, and that may not initially for you seem to count as much of a public space at all. But I want to argue that it is an important and emerging public space that is enabled by information and communication technologies, but doesn't resemble the blogosphere and the kinds of spaces that Lance talked about so interestingly yesterday. And I'll give you a couple of examples of what I'm calling data-driven public spaces, and then do a little bit of more descriptive analytic discussion about why exactly they should count as public spaces. And so I have a very pragmatic conception of democracy in which democracy, what it means for the people to exercise power, is for the people to be able to control the consequences of either public policy action or social interaction. And for me, that's what democracy is. And this is a little bit different from aggregate or even some deliberative conceptions of democracy, but it bears a lot of similarities. And basically the idea is that citizens have interests, and by interacting with one another, they form some common values that they articulate into a public will that they transmit to parties and politicians who control usually bureaucratic apparatuses that then pass policies and take state action. And this is the kind of problematic part in pragmatism that other conceptions of democracy ignore, that the world is complicated and that the policies and actions of bureaucratic agencies and social interaction generate consequences in the world, some of which are intended, but as we've seen very recently, some of which are not. And then those consequences in the world generate a reality that affects citizens' conceptions of their own interests and certainly their political preferences, and that's the pragmatic chain, as Dewey described it, John Dewey described it, that acts both at the social level and at the individual level. And I want to say that the functional contribution of public space on this conception of democracy is at least threefold. There is an epistemic contribution, and the epistemic contribution is that a public space should be a place in which citizens, officials, others gather together to figure out exactly what kind of world they live in. And if in a low-quality public space, they get it wrong, as I think many of us, and certainly many financial experts, got it wrong when they thought just very recently, tried to assess the risk characteristics of the financial decisions that we're taking. And we get it wrong all the time. And a better public space, one of the features of a good public space is that we get it right more often than we get it wrong. A second contribution of public space is interest articulation and the formation of public will. And this, I think, is the contribution that we focused on most so far, generally speaking, in our discussion, and what most people focus on when they think about the public sphere. They think about people coming together, encountering one another, beginning from positions of difference, and sometimes coming to positions of commonality, common enough to forge a public will. These two are, of course, related, but different functions. A third function of the public will is to generate a communicative kind of pressure and other kinds of pressure for official accountability. That is, if a public sphere generates a public will, another desirable feature of the public sphere is that it be able to hold officials to account, call them to explain why they're doing what they're doing, and how that relates to the public will that's been articulated. So these are at least three important functions of public spaces in the public sphere, and I think probably the three most important contributions of a public sphere to democracy. So I think in these conversations it just helps to be clear about how exactly public space relates to quite a different idea, which is democracy. And then, okay, so there are lots of different kinds of public spaces, some physical, some virtual, many of which we've discussed so far, and they have different contributions on these three dimensions. And now I want to really narrow the discussion quite a lot and draw your attention to one kind of public space that, as I said, may have escaped your attention. And I call these data-driven public spaces. And from this part of the discussion on, I'll proceed inductively, give you a few examples, and then talk about, generalize from those examples to connect up the specifics to this more general idea of public space, because it's a little bit unfamiliar. So here are a few examples of what I've called data-driven public spaces, some of which are a little bit more trivial, some of which are a little bit more serious. And if I can bring up, so nycuncivilservants.org is a site that allows anybody, mostly people in New York City, to post pictures of cars of public servants, teachers, police officers, etc., who are using their parking permits for illegal purposes, to park, to deliver their kids to school, to do their grocery shopping. And if you've driven around New York City, you know that parking is an extreme premium, and this makes people really, really mad. So this device, nycuncivilservants.org, is a site in which people take decentralized information that they have, namely information about which civil servants are violating which parking regulations, and make it public to generate a kind of horizontal shaming and street-level accountability. So that's one of the more trivial examples. But it's not trivial, I guess, if you live in New York City. People get pretty vexed about this issue. Okay, so some of these other examples, I won't show you all of them, but netmums.com is an extremely popular UK site that allows mothers, new mothers, and more experienced mothers to get together and talk about parenting and the challenges of parenting, and out of that they compare their experiences, and out of that experience oftentimes comes different kinds of public policy demands that they lodge on government to improve the conditions of parenting, to make parenting more successful. Greatschools.net is a site in the United States in which people compare the quality of different public schools across regions and come together to discuss public education issues. PatientsLikeMe.com is a for-profit site in which people afflicted by particular conditions, not Alzheimer's, I think it's AIDS, HIV, Parkinson's disease, several others, gather together. They're communities of the afflicted, and they gather together to discuss their common conditions, to try to improve their own self-diagnoses, to compare alternative therapies, and to compare the quality of different providers, healthcare providers, and different healthcare facilities. FixMyStreet.com, because I'm a kind of urban person, I like a lot. It's a UK site that enables anybody in the United Kingdom who sees a particular problem, like rubbish on the street that may have hazardous materials, to report that problem to the public. This is of course, a public site that anybody can look at. And so they take a picture of the problem, they describe it, they say when it occurred, and then this goes into the queue for public agencies to then fix that problem. So sometimes it's about graffiti, sometimes it's about abandoned cars, sometimes it's about rubbish on the street, other kind of annoyance activities. And this creates both a much better reporting and sensing system for the public to know what its urban environment is like, and then creates quite a bit of pressure on public agencies to take care of that problem, because you can kind of look at the site and see which problems and which areas of the city get more attention and which get less. Okay. And then finally, if you'll indulge me for a moment, this is a project that I'm working on for the November election called myfairelection.com. My friend Josh Cohen said I should name it something else because everything is, YouTube, my I thought that was a little narcissistic, but I think it's not bad marketing. And the idea here is that just like anyone, so everybody's probably bought a book on Amazon.com, and you can rate the book 1 to 5 stars, and then other people will read the ratings. The idea here is that you can rate your election experience 1 to 5 stars after you vote. So 5 stars, it was very easy, it took 5 minutes. 1 star, maybe there was some intentional intimidation, or the poll places were closed, or the machines were broken, right? And as we know, for those of you who paid some attention to the 2000 and 2004 elections in the United States, this is a big, big problem, right? The election impropriety, the difficulties of election administration end up make it so that many people are denied the opportunity to vote, violation of political equality. And so the idea is that if enough people do this on election day, then they will pool the private information about their own voting experience, and therefore the accessibility of the ballot, and generate in real time a heat map or a weather map of election conditions throughout the United States. And then so on election day, if everything goes well, or if everything goes well from my perspective, this site will be up, and then it'll be continuously updated, and so you'll be able to look at a map of the United States and see which places are relatively easy to vote in green, which places are more difficult to vote in red, and then you'd be able to zoom in on a particular state, and all the counties in that state would be displayed, and then some counties would be green, some be red, etc. So that's another example of a data-driven public space. Okay, so why call this public at all, or a public space at all? It's very different from the kinds of public spaces that we've discussed so far, and here are some dimensions of difference. First, these spaces are obviously focused on particular issues and problems that people have. They're not general public spaces like a sidewalk or a cafe or a bar or a blog in which people encounter each other and discuss with no particular agenda. These spaces have a very specific agenda. And a second difference is that these public spaces are not the kinds of public spaces in which citizens discard their private interest hat and put on their public interest and citizen hat and only think about the public good when they're there. Quite the opposite. They go to these spaces out of quite intimate concerns, oftentimes, about their own self-interest and whether or not it's being realized or not. And these spaces are public insofar as by engaging in them, people come to realize that they cannot satisfy their own self-interest without correcting some features of social interaction and sometimes public policy. So they come to the public, but they begin from the self. And then third and fourth, the dynamics of these spaces are that citizens contribute very private information and experience and make it public, and thereby, in doing that, they pool information and create, hopefully, a much more accurate picture of reality and a much more actionable picture of reality. So the main contribution of these kinds of public spaces is to increase the epistemic quality of democracy. So in different areas, by pooling quite distributed information, the hope is we get a much better picture of what reality is like. So the general epistemic information challenge is that in many areas, important information is widely distributed, oftentimes private, held by individuals, and it's so widely distributed that it's actually inconceivable that any centralized apparatus would be able to gather that information effectively. So in health, people obviously have very different health conditions, respond to different therapies differently, even have difficulty associating symptoms with underlying conditions because the human body is varied, health afflictions are varied, and then I could kind of go through the same kind of reasoning for neighborhood conditions, electoral conditions, etc. And then the dynamic is what Lance called yesterday crowdsourced information pooling, right? That the the information is the information of the many, of the crowds. Okay, so it's pretty clear how the dynamic improves epistemic quality, and here are some paths from a better sense of the way the world is to some kind of official accountability. So these are different pathways that connect up the data-driven public space to some sort of usually public policy decision or collective action. The first is epistemic force alone. Here, it's not the force of the better argument that carries the day with officials, but sometimes it is the force of just a changed sense of reality, right? And so in the 1970s and 1980s in the United States, there was a serious debate among economists about whether or not banks discriminated against low-income lenders who are members of racial minorities. And so some people said, no, we're just properly adjusting for risk. These are more risky bets. Other people said, that's not it. You're obviously discriminating based on the color of people's skin. A bunch of research and data gathering showed to a fact certain that it was discrimination and convinced pretty much everybody. And as a result, not just as a result of that, but largely as a result of that, the Federal Reserve and Congress passed a bunch of laws and policies that compelled banks to be more fair in their lending. So the epistemic shift there of we don't know exactly whether or not banks are discriminating to banks are definitely discriminating had a large kind of effect. A second line is shaming of public officials. That's clearly one intended effect of the fixmystreets.com. A third potential factor is that these data-driven public spaces can trigger existing accountability mechanisms. So the hope of fixmyelection.com is that, and they will be, election lawyers, journalists, and other people will be looking at this real-time data on election day, and once they know where the bad places are, will take action in real time. And those are existing mechanisms, but fed with a much better epistemic input, more or less. And then finally, these kinds of things may trigger collective public action. And then let me just spend a few minutes on limitations and challenges of conceptualizing these data-driven public spaces as public spaces. The first is that I haven't said much at all about the traditional main function of public spaces and the public sphere, which is interest articulation and deliberation. And the fact is that in these kinds of public spaces, there isn't much so far interest articulation and deliberation that occurs. But I think that's a fact of immaturity rather than a necessary fact about the quality of these spaces. So in some of them, like patientslikeme.com, there is quite a bit of deliberation about exactly how to interpret different symptoms and how to measure and gauge different health providers and the quality of doctors and healthcare facilities among one another. But in a bunch of the other sites that I mentioned, people just take the data as mostly given, don't talk about it that much, and use it as more or less. It's thought to be self-explanatory, which of course it's not, that all of those particular spaces would be better if they had more of a deliberative component. The second, and these problems are in order of roughly increasing worry and concern. Okay, so the second problem is that it's hard to see how exactly these public spaces would be deployed toward problems in which people have little perceived personal interest or stake. And I think that that's a real problem, because the logic is that people go to these spaces out of some personal interest and then come to some more public realization. That is a realization that features of the public and the qualities of public action deeply impact their own well-being. So I think it is genuinely hard to get people to go to a space like this if there is little perceived personal impact. And to the extent that public spaces have been successfully kind of created, intentional public spaces that have some connection to decision making that occur for people that occur on issues where people have little perceived personal stake. It is difficult to engineer and oftentimes happens by being a special event that people get some selective benefits from, more or less. And then the third problem is scale. Many of the issues that I talked about occur at the very intimate personal scale or at the neighborhood scale. It's a little bit harder to see how these data-driven public spaces could operate for problems that occur at much larger scale. Although people are working on this problem. Friend and colleague is working on a data-driven space that's intended to create conversation and allow measurement of the social and environmental impacts of multinational corporations. And obviously multinational corporations operate at a much larger scale. And so there are some efforts in that regard. And then so that's about the end of my formal presentation. So, you know, in sum, what I've tried to do is two very different things. First of all, be a little bit more clear about a conception of democracy, and then a little bit more clear about the conceptions of public space and the contributions of public space to that democracy. And then second, draw your attention to a little corner. There are many categories of public spaces, obviously, and then draw your attention to one that may have escaped your recognition so far, and that is these data-driven public spaces that enable crowdsourced information and some public accountability. Thank you very much.